Cheyenne, Wyoming, autumn 1889. A single father walked into Whitfield's general store, carrying a hungry infant in one arm and a dented tin of milk in the other. Before winter ended, the wealthiest widow in Wyoming would risk her fortune, her reputation, and her heart for the father and son standing before her. The wind followed Nathaniel through the door, scattering dust across the old floorboards. His coat was thin, his boots were cracked, the baby against his chest was wrapped in a blanket worn nearly through. Near a shelf of imported tea stood Margaret Hale. At 40, Margaret owned more than most men in Cheyenne, a fine house, silver shares, land enough to see the mountains from every window. But after losing her only son years earlier, she lived in a home that felt painfully empty. She noticed Nathaniel because of the way he held the child, not carelessly, not impatiently. He held the baby as though this small life was the last precious thing the world had left him. The man approached the heavy wooden counter, his steps hesitant, heavy with shame. The shopkeeper, Jonas Webb, wore spectacles perched on the tip of his nose and did not look up from his ledger. "Back again, Nathaniel?" he asked, his voice flat. Nathaniel set a small, dented tin on the counter. The faded label read, "Milk for Infants." "I need you to take this back," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Jonas looked up slowly. "You bought that 3 days ago on credit." "I know," he replied, tightening his grip on the bundle in his arms. "The mine let half its men go yesterday. I was one of them." Jonas gave a humorless laugh. "This isn't a charity house, Cross. If I take it back now, I can't sell it full price. The seal's scratched, the tin's dented." "Please, Jonas," Nathaniel looked down at his son. "He needs the milk. But I need money for firewood tonight," he admitted, his voice nearly breaking. "If I keep the milk, he may freeze. If I return it, he may go hungry." The baby, Noah, let out a thin, weak whimper, a sound that pierced every heart in the room. Most patrons turned away. They didn't want to see the ugly face of poverty. But Margaret was truly listening. She saw how Nathaniel's hands shook, calloused, scarred, workers' hands, yet he held the infant with a tenderness that didn't match his rough exterior.
"No returns on opened goods," Jonas snapped, slamming his ledger shut. "Take your milk and get out. Don't come back without real silver." Nathaniel froze, humiliation radiating off him. He reached for the tin with white knuckles. The baby's cry grew louder, desperate, hungry. That cry reached a place inside Margaret that had been silent for 20 years. Her son Daniel had died of fever before his 7th birthday. She still remembered the last night she held him, and the silence afterward most of all. She could not listen to another child cry while grown people looked away. Margaret stepped out from behind the shelves, her silk dress rustling like a sudden breeze. "Mr. Webb?" she said, her voice clear and cold, cutting through the tension like a blade. The shopkeeper froze. "Mrs. Hale? I didn't realize you were still here." She kept her eyes on the man in the worn coat. Nathaniel looked at her with shock and weariness, seeing her fine jewelry, her styled hair, a world of wealth he'd never touch. "Put the milk back in his bag." "But ma'am, he can't pay his debt." "I didn't ask about his balance," she interrupted. She pulled a heavy gold coin from her reticule and set it on the counter with a firm click. "This covers his debt in full. It also covers 6 more tins of that milk to carry the boy through winter, 2 sacks of your best flour, and the finest wool blankets in your storeroom." The store went silent. Nathaniel stared at the coin as though it were a fallen star. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't take handouts." Margaret's expression softened. "This isn't charity, Mr. Cross. It's help from one parent who knows what it means to lose a child. Winter doesn't care about pride. Tonight, your son needs warmth more than you need to owe no one." Nathaniel looked down at his crying son, and his resolve finally crumbled. A tear tracked through the dirt on his cheek. "I have nothing to give you in return," he whispered, Then repay me by keeping him safe. When you can work again, help someone who has less than you." Jonas hurried to gather the goods. Nathaniel quietly set the flour back on the shelf. "The milk and one blanket are enough," he said. "I won't take more than Noah needs." Margaret studied
Him. Most men took everything within reach. This man, who had almost nothing, was trying to leave something behind. Watching him struggle to lift the crate while holding his son, she said, "Wait, my carriage is outside. Let my driver take you home." Nathaniel hesitated. "I live in the shanties by the rail tracks. It's no place for a lady's carriage." "A carriage is just wood, leather, and wheels," Margaret said. "It goes where it's told." Her driver, Thomas, didn't blink at the sight of the ragged man. He'd served Margaret for years and knew her heart was finally waking from its long sleep. As the carriage rolled through the freezing streets, the baby quieted, soothed by the warmth of the cabin. "My name is Nathaniel Cross," he said quietly, "and this is Noah." "I'm Margaret," she replied. "Tell me your story." He told her of his wife, Elizabeth, who died after Noah's birth in an isolated mining camp, the nearest doctor arriving too late. He told her of his dream of a small ranch near the foothills, a dream that had led him west into nothing but hard labor and bitter loss. Margaret listened, aching, seeing a father drowning in bad luck. When they reached the shanties, she was horrified. Homes of scrap metal and old crates, wind cutting through the gaps, children playing barefoot in frozen mud. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale," Nathaniel said, stepping out with the crate and his son. "I'll find a way to repay this." "Just keep him warm," she said. "That's the only payment I require." As the carriage pulled away, Margaret looked back at the lone, defiant figure against a bleak sky and knew she couldn't simply leave him there. That night, she opened a room in her house that had stayed locked for 20 years. Daniel's small wooden horse still stood on the mantel, his childhood coat still hung behind the door. She lifted his photograph, wondering for one frightening moment whether she was helping Noah only to fill the space Daniel had left. "No," she whispered, "no child could replace Daniel." But loving his memory didn't mean ignoring another child in need. She set the photograph down and rang for Thomas. The next morning, she made a decision that would shock the city. She called her lawyer and estate manager. "I want to reopen the old cottage on the North Ridge, and I want to hire a groundskeeper immediately." "But ma'am," her manager protested, "we haven't
Had one in 5 years. The grounds are fine as they are." "The grounds are dead and cold," she said. "I want someone who knows how to work the land, who cares about growth and life." She sent Thomas back to the shanties with a letter. 2 hours later, Nathaniel stood on her porch, confused and guarded, still wearing his thin coat. "There's a cottage on the North Hill," Margaret said. "A stone fireplace, a garden plot. It needs a man's hand to bring it back to life. The pay is fair and milk is provided." Nathaniel didn't reach for the keys. "You've already done too much. I won't live on your land as another object of charity." "You won't," she said. "You'll work for your wages. And if I fail, then I'll dismiss you like any other employee." The corner of his mouth almost lifted. "Take a week to inspect the cottage. If the work seems unfair, you may leave owing me nothing." "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "I know what it's like to be alone," Margaret said, "and Noah deserves a warm room, a real window, and mountains to wake up to." Nathaniel looked at his sleeping son, then at the distant cottage. "I'll work for every dollar," he said, and only then did he accept the keys. The following weeks brought cruel whispers. The wealthy widow had taken in a drifter, the women of Cheyenne's social circle murmured over tea, certain he'd rob her blind. Margaret ignored every word. She began walking to the cottage each afternoon. The walk cleared her head and warmed her spirit. She brought wooden toys for Noah, leather-bound books for Nathaniel. She watched him repair the split-rail fence with steady hammer strikes, watched color return to his face.
For the first month, Nathaniel accepted nothing beyond his wages. When Margaret left a food basket, he returned half of it. When Thomas overpaid him by $1, he walked through snow to give it back. He repaired the fence, cleared the frozen well, restored the orchard without being asked. Margaret had spent years around men who praised her wealth while calculating what they could take from it. Nathaniel never asked what she owned, only what needed doing. One evening, the first real snow of December began to fall, soft as feathers. Margaret stayed late at the cottage, sitting by the small hearth, a room far smaller than her ballroom, but filled with a warmth her mansion lacked. "I found this in the garden today," Nathaniel said, "and her a smooth river stone shaped like a heart. I used to find these for Elizabeth. I wanted you to have this one." Margaret took it, her fingers brushing his rough skin, and felt, for the first time in years, a spark of real, unadorned connection. It wasn't just charity anymore, and that realization frightened her. What if he saw only her fortune? Worse, what if she was using Noah to fill the space Daniel had left? She closed her fingers around the stone. For the first time in years, she had something to lose again. But the world outside was not so kind. A few days later, members of the town council arrived at her gate, led by Charles Bennett, an old, bitter rival of her late husband, a man who smelled of cigars and greed. "Mrs. Hale," he began, with a cold, practiced smile, "there are complaints about your new employee. He spoke at a miners' meeting in Leadville before he was dismissed. Some investors call him an agitator." "Was he accused of a crime?" "No." "Then you've brought me gossip, not evidence." Margaret held her ground. "He is my employee and my guest. He's done nothing but work hard and care for his son with more honor than you possess." "The North Ridge was acquired under an older survey," Charles said. "My attorneys believe the boundary can be challenged. If you keep sheltering this man, I may ask the court to freeze every transfer tied to that land." It was a direct threat to her fortune. She knew he'd been circling her silver claims for years. That night, she told Nathaniel, trying to hide her fear. "I should leave tonight," he said flatly. "I've caused you enough trouble. I'll take Noah and find a camp south." "No," Margaret said, reaching for his hand. "If you leave, the bullies win, and Noah goes back into the cold. I won't let that happen." "What about your money, your standing in this town?" "My money has bought me nothing but walls," she said. "My standing is built on shadows. I'd rather lose their approval than abandon what I know is right. Wealth has protected me from hardship, Nathaniel. It has never protected me from loneliness." It was a bold stand for any woman in 1889, when a woman's reputation was her only real currency. But Margaret Hale was done playing by the old rules. By morning, she'd made her decision not to fight Charles quietly through lawyers, but publicly. She stood on a platform before the courthouse as a crowd gathered in the biting cold. Charles,
Smug in the front row. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "I have signed a protected 5-year lease to the North Ridge cottage to Nathaniel Cross. If he fulfills the work agreement and improves the land, he will have the legal right to purchase the homestead for $1. The agreement is signed, witnessed, and recorded with the county clerk." Nathaniel hadn't known about the purchase clause. His face tightened, not with greed, but the fear of receiving more than he'd earned. Margaret gave him the smallest shake of her head. "Not a gift, a future you must build. And I am investing my silver shares into a new project, a nursery and school for this city's rail workers' children." The crowd gasped as one. This was more than scandal. It was a quiet social revolution. Charles's face turned deep purple. "You cannot do that. Those shares are tied to the Hale name. They are mine to use as I please, and if you challenge this agreement, you'll have to explain in open court why a lawful employee and his infant son threaten you so deeply." She stepped down as the crowd parted before her. The victory came at a steep price.
The socialites stopped calling. Her mansion was struck from every guest list. Banks refused credit to her school project. Merchants canceled contracts. Anonymous letters warned her to send Nathaniel away before she lost everything. For several nights she sat alone with the letters spread before her, wondering if courage and foolishness were separated by only a single step. Still, each morning she looked toward the cottage chimney. As long as smoke rose from it, Noah was warm. That was enough to keep her moving forward. Her mansion now felt too vast and empty, so she spent most of her time at the cottage instead, planting a winter garden, building a small glass greenhouse, learning to wash clothes by hand, learning to soothe a teething Noah. Nathaniel, in turn, worked late into the night, carving Margaret a vanity table from mountain oak, more beautiful than anything from Europe, determined to prove himself worthy of her gift. But the greatest test was still coming. In late December, one of the worst blizzards in years swept down from the mountains. By nightfall, the temperature had plunged far below zero, snow burying roads and fences in towering drifts. Alone by her fire, Margaret was terrified for the cottage. Its stone walls were thick, but the roof was old. A frantic pounding came at the service door. It was Nathaniel, coated in ice, his face a ghastly blue, gasping for air, too cold to breathe. "The roof caved in," he choked out. "Where's Noah?" Margaret screamed into the wind. "I wrapped him in every blanket we had and placed him in the old root cellar," Nathaniel said. He'd packed it with straw and wedged the milk crate beside him to shield him from falling beams. "A fallen beam blocked the opening. He's sheltered below it, but I can't reach him alone." Margaret grabbed her fur cloak. The staff had already taken shelter below, and there was no time to gather them, and they stepped into the white abyss together. The wind nearly knocked them flat. Nathaniel wrapped his own coat around her shoulders. "You'll need it," she protested. "So will you," he said. "I can't lose another person to the cold." They crawled up the ridge, effectively blind in the snow. The cottage was a ruin. Its roof collapsed, the cellar trapdoor buried under fallen boards. "Noah!" Nathaniel called. A faint cry answered. Together they cleared the boards until their hands went numb. Nathaniel heaved a massive oak beam aside with a father's desperate strength. Margaret reached through the opening and found the wool blanket, and then Noah, cold and frightened, but awake. The crate and blankets from Whitfield's store had shielded him. They huddled together in the ruins as the storm raged around them, Nathaniel shielding them both with his body. "We have to get back to the house," he whispered. "I can't move my legs," she said. "You have to," he urged. "You have to move for him." He tucked Noah beneath his coat, pulled her arm across his shoulders, and helped her stand. Step by step, they moved through the storm, and when her knees finally failed, he carried her the rest of the way, stumbling into drifts, falling twice, always standing back up. They collapsed onto the rug of the great hall as they burst through the mansion doors. Margaret managed to stoke the dying fire, and they lay there together, shivering and spent. As the sun rose over a white world, silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. Margaret opened her eyes to find Nathaniel by the fire, Noah against his chest, his free hand still wrapped around hers. "You stayed," she whispered. "So did you," he said, as if the answer had always been simple.
The following year, Margaret sold her mansion and moved to a smaller house on the North Ridge. She kept enough of her silver holdings to fund the workers' school and rebuild the cottage into a proper ranch house. Nathaniel didn't ask her to marry him right away. He waited until the orchard bore its first fruit and he completed the terms of their agreement. The evening he signed the homestead deed, he placed the heart-shaped stone in her palm once more. "The first time I gave you this," he said, "I had nothing else. And now," she asked, "now I have a home, a son, and a life I want to share with you." Margaret closed her hand around the stone. You had those things before, Nathaniel. You only needed someone to see them. They married beneath the young orchard trees, Noah asleep in Thomas's arms. She no longer cared about the gossip. She wasn't the wealthy widow anymore. She was just Margaret, a woman who found a family in a storm. Nathaniel became a respected rancher, turning dry land into green pasture. Noah grew tall and strong, a true child of the frontier. They lived simply, far from polished society, never again the wealthiest family in Wyoming, but in every way that mattered, the richest, with warmth, work, laughter, and someone waiting at the end of each day. Margaret finally understood that true wealth was not what a person kept, but what they were willing to share. Years later, Noah visited Whitfield's general store with his own young son. Near the stove, Margaret and Nathaniel sat side by side, hands resting together. Noah's son pointed to a dented tin displayed above the counter. "Why did grandfather keep that old thing?" he asked. Nathaniel smiled. "It started with a return," the old man said, "and it ended with a new beginning." Margaret rested her head against his shoulder. On the mantel beside the old tin sat the heart-shaped stone. Loving again hadn't erased Daniel. It had simply let his memory grow into something larger than grief. This story leaves behind a simple truth. Real worth is measured by character, not what fills a bank account. And the greatest wealth anyone can hold is the compassion they're willing to share with someone in need. Winter never shows mercy, but a heart that stays open can turn even the harshest storm into warmth. That is the lasting lesson here. Love and kindness outlive fortune every time.